Between the summer of 1797 and the summer of 1798, William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge spent almost every day together. Much of that time was spent talking about poetry, in particular the volume that the two of them would later publish as Lyrical Ballads. Much of this talk took place in and around the Quantock Hills. Coleridge was living in Nether Stowey in Somerset, and Wordsworth was living not that far off in a house called Alfoxden, also in Somerset. And the two would generally meet at Coleridge's house in Somerset and take off walking. Dorothy, William's sister, would often join. And when the three of them would go walking among the Quantock Hills, lovely countryside, they would take notebooks, pencils. They would take sometimes portable chairs, and they would basically set up and do with pencils and paper what landscape painters would do with easels and paint. They would jot down their most immediate, particular impressions of the natural world. The more nuanced and subtle, the better. They were really trying to teach themselves how to see the natural world not through the abstractions of 18th century landscape poetry, but through their own very specific moods, dispositions, and so on. These jottings would later be turned into poems. Most notably, Coleridge's jottings made their way into his great conversation poem, This Lime Tree Bower My Prison. And they made their way into Wordsworth's great lines composed a few miles from Tintern Abbey, often simply known a few miles above Tintern Abbey. Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, often just simply known as Tintern Abbey. Tintern Abbey became the sort of apex of lyrical ballads. It was the last poem in the collection, still seen as one of Wordsworth's greatest poems. So this is what happened. Again, a new way of attempting to interact in a very concrete, immediate way with the natural world, and the transformation of fragments of perception into more cogent poems about the relationship between mind and nature. Now, I bring this up to note how Wordsworth, many years later, 8 years before his death, around 1842, revised very much his personal history to try to exemplify his idea of what ideal perception should be. And this idea about what perception properly should be helps us understand what Wordsworth wanted to accomplish in his major poetry. So there was an Irish poet, Aubrey de Vere, who interviewed Wordsworth in 1842, thereabouts, and for a book he was writing. And in the course of conversation with Wordsworth, and again, Wordsworth's quite an old man at this point, Wordsworth says this, that nature does not permit an inventory to be made of her charms. He should have left his pencil and notebook at home, meaning the poet, any poet, should have left his pencil and notebook at home, fixed his eye as he walked with reverent attention on all that surrounded him, and taken all into a heart that could understand and enjoy. Then, after several days had passed by, he should have interrogated his memory as to the scene. He would have discovered that while much of what he had admired was preserved to him, much was also wisely obliterated. That which remained, the picture surviving in his mind, would have presented the ideal and essential truth of the scene, and done so in large part by discarding much which, though in itself striking, was not characteristic. So if 1797, 1798 was ruled by what we might just call casual, indeed random experience, casual, random, fragmented experience of the natural world, which is how experience does unfold, we can probably say safely. As opposed to this, Wordsworth imagines a model in which the poet goes into the natural world without a notebook, without a pencil, and simply takes in what he takes in, but his mind is this sort of filter, and each of us would have our own filter. We take in and remember what we most say need to remember, and the rest we forget. We don't need actively to record what's around us. We rather simply need to exist, to be, and trust that we will remember what we need to remember and the rest will be left behind. And it is what we remember properly that should become the matter of poetry. So this tells us a lot about what Wordsworth thought ultimately about proper perception. Proper perception does not grow from a desire to capture the moment as it is. Proper perception rather grows from an innate need to hold in the mind certain experiences that will ultimately enrich our lives. As Wordsworth says in Tintern Abbey, that any present experience hopefully will provide life and food for future years. In other words, we know innately what we should remember from a given experience that will ultimately enliven us in the future. And if you're a poet, you trust that whatever you remember from a given experience will become the content of the poems you will write later. So what we have here in this later account of how the poet perceives is a kind of therapeutic perception. The idea that we have within us the tools, a kind of filtering system that will hold what we most need for a rich life and will let go what we don't need. So there's a lot of faith in this second idea of how the poet properly perceives. And ultimately, there's a sense that there's no such thing as a present perception, as in an immediate perception right here, right now, that simply takes place. Rather, all perceptions are in some ways simultaneously retrospective and prospective. What does that mean? It means that if I'm out in the natural world for a whole day without my notebook, the parts of that experience that I perceive that I will hold on to long after, on the one hand, there's already a sense that these are memories, that strong perceptions are strong perceptions are proven strong only insofar as they become strong memories. But also, the strong perception that will become a memory also has a kind of forward-looking power in that it will nourish my life. It will be meaningful to me. Perhaps it will be a spot of time, an especially significant moment for me in shaping who I'll become in the future. So what do we see here? We see two models of perception. One we can call a desire to capture the quickness of the present moment as it is without projecting upon it any hope necessarily for lasting value. That's what actually happened in 1797 through 1798 in the Quantocks. And the second is a mode of perception that is ultimately more concerned with the past and the future, and how a given moment will rise up out of time and remain as a kind of powerful lodestone that will give us power as we live our lives. Virginia Woolf would call such memories moments of being. So that's what I want us to get. So when Wordsworth writes a poem like Tintern Abbey, or he writes a poem like um, Intimations Ode, Intimations of Immortality from Recollections of Early Childhood, or a poem like Resolution and Independence. In these poems, they're very much about how the mind remembers what it most needs to remember to live a valuable life. Wordsworth does have other poems where we get to see on display a poet very much in the present moment. But ultimately, Wordsworth moved away from that to a kind of high argument about what the mind is like as a shaper of the natural world. And ultimately, we see Wordsworth developing this idea in contradistinction, not so much to Coleridge, but to his sister Dorothy, whose journals are just scintillating. They're electric with all these great details, sometimes of experiences that Wordsworth himself had. She'll write a brilliant immediate paragraph about daffodils by the lake that are simply daffodils by the lake. She describes them with such specificity, they become lyrical. And then Wordsworth turning the same experience into his poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, where the daffodils symbolize how the mind can turn experiences into valuable memories. So these are lessons to glean from this story I'm telling. But a final lesson is Wordsworth's desire to revise his very history to make it fit into his vision of how he wants his life to be. If he were being accurate, he would probably have said to Aubrey de Vere, hey, I took a notebook and a pencil out all the time back in the days when I was composing the poems that made it into lyrical ballads. But instead, he seems to suggest that he never did that, and that instead, from a very early age, he understood the mind as a mansion of glorious forms that can illuminate our days far beyond the immediate experience.